Hello, welcome once again to the Fair Minded Christian YouTube channel. I'm your host, Stephen, and today is part 2 in our series called To Eat or Not to Eat? That is the question. Today we will be covering Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through 23. So picking up where we left off last week in Matthew chapter 15, verse 1 through 20, we saw Jesus interacting with the scribes and Pharisees regarding this issue of eating bread with unwashed hands. Now here in Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through 23, in a very similar and synoptic way, we are also given an account of the events surrounding this interaction. But in Mark, a few more details are brought forth which bring emphasis to this issue of eating bread with unwashed hands. In Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through 8, we read, Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the traditions of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? He answered and said to them, Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandments of God, you hold the traditions of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. Here in Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through 8, if you were to count, you would notice that the word washed is used a total of 6 times in some form. And it is translated directly from the Greek term nipto, meaning to clean the hands, the feet, or the face. Now, the fact it is used repeatedly during this interaction suggests to us that this issue of washing is the main point of emphasis. Therefore, the listener and the reader should pay special attention to this particular term. And in verses 9 through 13 we read, He said to them, All too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, If a man says to his father or mother, Whatever profit you might have received from me is korban, that is, a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition which you have handed down, and many such things you do. So here in verses 9 through 13, he gives them a clear example as to how they use their traditions to circumvent the requirements of God's commandments, by pointing out the 5th commandment in particular, which instructs us to honor our parents. He does this in order to demonstrate to those present the apparent contradiction and hypocrisy of these scribes and Pharisees. Now, in our modern society, we call this type of maneuver a loophole, which is a way of avoiding a legal requirement that would otherwise apply by means of an omission or ambiguity in the wording of the law. And in verses 14 through 16 we read, When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, Hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the thing which comes out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears, let him hear. Here in verses 14 through 16, the main point Jesus wants his audience to understand regarding this issue of eating bread without first washing your hands in the prescribed manner is that, contrary to the Pharisees' opinion, this actually does not defile a person. And that word defile is from the Greek word koineo, meaning to make ritually unclean for religious fellowship purposes, like attending a Bible study, for instance. But for the first century Jews, this would have involved whether or not a person was allowed entry into either the temple or the synagogue. And although many believe that with this statement, Jesus is giving Christians everywhere permission to eat what the Bible considers prohibited unclean meats, as outlined in Leviticus chapter 11, based on the simple reading of the text, that clearly is not the case. As a matter of fact, there is no mention at all regarding the eating of prohibited unclean meats not defiling a man, just eating bread with unwashed hands. And because the subject of eating prohibited unclean meats is not mentioned by Jesus in the text, we won't include it in our interpretation either, because doing so would be totally assumptive, and it's never a good idea to assume. And in verses 17 through 22 we read, "When he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, 'Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him? Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods.' And he said, 'What comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of man, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man.'" Starting in verse 17, the disciples asked Jesus to explain the parable to them, which is exactly what we saw in Matthew 15, which we covered in part 1, where it mentioned that it was Peter who was asking this question. And as a reminder, the word parable in English is transliterated from the Greek word parabola, which is defined as a comparative statement or story designed to illustrate or explain a concept or idea. It's very similar to a metaphor. Now, a simple example of this is when we use the common statement, "When the cats are away, the mice will play." Now, when we hear this, we don't take this statement literally, but understand it to mean that when those in authority are absent, those who are subservient will break the rules. In the same way, Jesus is using this illustration to encourage his audience to be more concerned about the evil thoughts in their minds rather than the dirt on their hands. Because according to Jesus, it is these evil thoughts that actually makes a person ritually unclean. Jesus goes on in verses 18 through 22 to begin to explain the parable by asking his disciples rhetorically, "Do you still not understand? Listen, contrary to the Pharisees' teaching, what goes into the mouth, meaning eating bread with unwashed hands, doesn't defile a man. However, what comes out of the mouth, meaning our evil thoughts expressed in words and actions, now that is what actually defiles a man." Now, many will point to the phrase mentioned at the very end of verse 19, which says, "Thus purifying all foods," and claim that with this statement, Jesus is in essence giving Christians everywhere a green light to eat what the Bible states are prohibited unclean meats, as outlined in Leviticus chapter 11. But is that in fact true? Well, that's a great question. And the best way to answer it will depend on what translation of the Bible you are using. If it's the New King James Version, which I regularly use, the word "thus" at the end of verse 19 is listed in italics, which would indicate that the words that come after it were inserted by the Bible translators themselves, meaning that the entire phrase is not the words of Jesus. And some translations even have the end of verse 19 separated from the rest of the verse in parentheses, such as the English Standard Version. the Good News Translation, the New International Version, and the New American Standard Version. These parentheses are there to clearly indicate that what's contained within them was a later addition made by the translators in their attempt to explain the meaning of Jesus' parable. So it's important to note that this is simply their opinion and not the actual words of Jesus. And grammatically speaking, the purpose of parentheses is for the writer to amplify or explain the words or phrases that precede it, oftentimes based on their own biases and presuppositions. Now, an example of this, if you were reading a biography today, where you can easily distinguish between the words of the author and the main characters, would be as follows. When Jason found out his son had several speeding tickets, he said he was going to kill him. Open parenthesis, meaning he was going to punish him. Close parenthesis. As you can see, contained within the parentheses, the author of the biography is attempting to explain what it is that the main character means, that being Jason. Now, could Jason very well have intended to literally kill his son? Well, we don't know, but we are trusting that the author's explanation is true and accurate, even though the author could be totally wrong. Because the author's words are not the actual words of the main character, Jason, what we're reading could simply be the personal perspective of the author. This additional phrase inserted by the translator in their attempt to interpret the words of Jesus here in Mark chapter 7, verse 19, are even more pronounced in the King James Version of the Bible, which reads as follows: "Because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats." Now, it is clear that the subject and context of this entire interaction between Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees is concerning the issue of eating bread without first washing one's hands. But the translator mysteriously changes the subject from bread to meat with the phrase, "purging all meats," which is a clear indication he is inserting his own presuppositions and biases into the text, because that phrase is not the words of Jesus. So according to the only two gospel accounts that we have, if Jesus never authorized Christians to eat what the Bible considers prohibited unclean meats, as outlined in Leviticus chapter 11, where did this idea come from? Maybe from his apostles? Well, let's see if we can find out by moving on to the Acts of the Apostles in part 3 of our series called To Eat or Not to Eat. That is the question.